Okay, I'm going to take a look at coding up, chapter 6, problem 23. Um, this, what we're going to do is write a program that will simulate the tossing of a coin. Okay, so this is right what it is right here. Um, Probably what I'll start with is first is just setting it at 50%. I think this way, if we do it at 50% first, half the time it's head, half the time the tails, and we can modify it to work for 60% after that. Okay. So the user needs to enter a number of tosses. All right. Then we're going to print the number of tosses that yielded heads and the number of tosses that yielded tails. Okay. So for example, what's our expectation? If we, flip the coin 100 times, we would expect, approximately, 60 of them would be heads up and, you know, 40 would be tails up. Okay. So let's start with this. We'll do Visual Studio Community here. New project, console app, and this is going to be, I'll just follow my coding standard here. Chapter 6, problem 23. Okay, and we'll create that. And I put it on the desktop. Okay. And as before, I'm just going to get rid of all this. Get rid of this. Okay. All right. So we start off with using namespace std, and I'll do a system pause here. Okay. So first thing is that we need to have a function, or we need to perform the operation of flipping a coin. Okay. And one of the things that in C++, they actually have a function, a random number generation function. It's called rand. Um, but what we need to do is we need to use it in a certain fashion in this case, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go on page 285 of the text, and there's a function defined. It's called rand underscore integer, int. Okay. And I'm just going to type it in exactly how it's shown in the text. Really don't need to modify it at all. All right. And I'm going to go down here, and here's the actual function definition. Rand underscore int. And you can put the variable name here if you want. Really doesn't matter. Oh, forgot my semicolon. You can put it here or not. Really doesn't matter. You don't have to put it there. You could leave it out. But let's go in here. A, comma, integer b. Okay. And the a and the b are really going to specify our ranges for this. And I'm just going to go and type it in exactly how it's in the text. Rand. So this is the function, rand. And actually, this is the function that's part of C++ called rand. And this will actually generate a number between 0 and, I think it's like 32,768. And it does it in a uniform fashion. So it randomly generates all numbers equally likely. But what we need to do is we need to modify it so that it will go between the range defined by A and B. Okay? So let's do that. And like I said, I'm just taking it exactly as it is in the text. I say plus 1 plus A. Okay? So when I execute this and I put in some numbers, all the numbers will be equally likely. Okay? So what I can do is I can actually say, like, maybe A is 0. Maybe that's tails. And then B would be 1. So generate a number between 0 and 1, equally likely. So what I'm going to do is I'll go in here and I'll just say, let me put this in. How about a counter? I'll define a counter first, right? Because I need to keep track of the number of heads. So I'll call it heads count. and I'll set it equal to 0. And then I'll do tails count, and I'll set that equal to 0 also. Okay. So when I call this function, and you can actually see it returns an integer data type, right? So it'll return a number between this range. And if I call this function with a 0 and a 1, it will give me back a number either 0 or 1. So I'm going to make one more variable here. I'll put it on a new line. Rand number. Okay, so that's actually going to be the number that gets returned. Rand number. Do this. Okay. So the next thing I'll do is I'm going to just do a cout rand number. And I just want to see that this number is either a 0 or a 1, right? Just to see that it works up to this point. Save all. Let me maximize this. And I run it. And it gives me a 1. Okay, so I'm good with that. Let me abort this. Yeah. Runs it twice with my virus checking here. Close that. Okay, so it gave me 1. That's good. That's within the range. All right. Now what I want to do is I want to run this a certain number of times. Now, if I look back at the problem statement, it says the user enters the number of tosses. Okay, so I also need another variable here. I'm going to call this comma tosses. Okay, and let's do that. Let's do a cout. Enter the number of tosses. And I'll add one more thing here. I'll do this. I'll say cout program to simulate the tossing of a coin. Inline. Okay. Then you enter the number of tosses. So then you do cin tosses. Okay. So now the user will enter those number of tosses in, and then we'll use that information. Okay. Well, what is a toss? Well, a toss essentially is one execution of this, right? So it produces either 0 or 1. Essentially, it represents a toss happening. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'll put this inside of a loop. And I'll say integer I equal to, I don't know, we can start at 1, I suppose. And then we'll say I less than tosses. I will say less than or equal to tosses. And then I plus plus. And I'll put this all inside of here. Okay. So let's just see if it works up to this point. So our expectation is we put the number of tosses in, and then it generates the number of that number, right? It'll actually run it that many times. So let's just run this, and it'll prompt us for the number of tosses, and I'll say 10. And there it is. There's my 10, either zeros or ones, okay? And like I said, what we can do is we can actually make it either 0 or 1 to represent heads or tails. Okay. So this is what we'll do. So when a number is generated, what we need to do is we need to count it. Okay? Is it a head or is it a tail? So inside of here, I'll tell you what, I'll leave my cout there. If it's either equal to heads or tails, right? If rand number equals 0, then I want to increment tails count. Okay? Else, heads count gets incremented. Oh, you know what? I gotta follow. I'm gonna follow my coding standard here with camel notation. Let me do this, and then I'll do that right here. So increment the tails count and increment heads count here. Okay, so it's either gonna do one or the other, right? Then I do an output. I'll put a message out here. See out the number of tails, and I'll say that equal. And of course, I'll just do this as tails count, and there's tails count. And then I'll do end line. And I'll do the same thing for the other one, right? For heads. And I'll call this one heads count. Okay. And then we'll run it. Save it all. It actually saves automatically when you go ahead and execute it. Okay. So I'm going to put 10. And we get 7 and 3. I'm going to do it again. And 7 and 3 again. Okay. Let me do 100. 100. 52 and 48. Okay. One of the things you're going to notice is that it runs in the actual random number generator is a function. And it's actually this function right here, like I said. And we just modified this function so that it would produce a number between 0 and 1. And when we did that, we modify. Essentially, this function here runs the same function over and over again. Okay, so there's no change in this function, and every single time it'll go through an algorithm and run a so-called pseudo random number generator, and it runs the same algorithm every time. But there's one thing we can do, and what we can do in our program is we can make it so that it'll run differently every time, right? And the way we do that is with this thing called the random seed function, call to a random seed function. We only need to do that once. So I'm going to do this. It's called SRAND. And I'm going to pass this variable in. Let me stop this. So what you can actually do is call srand, and you pass in this function called time and pass this value null into the function, which is just, it's actually just essentially a 0. You're passing in a 0 for it. And then I need to include the include file. And you can actually find this on different places online. I went to C++, has it there, cplus.com. And you can see it's just time.h is the actual include file we want. Oh, don't write that. Include time.h. Okay. Got an extra double quote there. Okay. Now when you run it, if you go and run this function, what you're going to find is that each time now, if I do 100, now we got 55 and 45. All right, runs twice here. Number toss is 100, and there it is, 43 and 57. Okay, so if you seed the random number generator, you only have to do it once in your program. And what that does is now, from now on, every single, what it does is actually writes a number here, and the number is the time in milliseconds since like 1980 or something. And since the number's different every time, what it does is it starts this random number function at a different location each time. Okay, so you make a call to srand with time, and this works out really well in terms of making this more random, more of a true random number generator. Okay, all right. So we did that. We have the counts. Now, what we're finding here in this case, of course, is that it's about 50% of the time is we get heads and we get tails. Okay? So really it has to do with this, right? It's like 60. We have a range here. I'm doing it from 0 and 1, 0 and 1, 0 and 1. Well, we have some choices. There's another function called random float that we could use. And random underscore float, actually, we'll use that later in another program that I'm going to take a look at, probably next time, or this time. uh, that we can use that function and specify range. And the way we can do this and how we can use the random number generator is what we can say here is let's generate a number um, from 0 to 100. And instead of doing it like this, saying it's equal to 0 or equal to 1, what we'll say is that if the number, random number between 0, we'll say less than or equal to, and we'll go from 0 up to 40, because we want 60% of the time it's heads up. So 0 to 40 will give us essentially, well, that will be our tails. And from, you know, 41 all the way up through 100 will give us our heads. So if we run this. Oh, and one other thing, since it's I'm going to do 1 because I included 100, so it would be 1 to 100. So it would be 1 through 40, so that's my 40% of the time. And then, 41 up through 100 will be my 60% of the time. So now if I run this, what you'll see, number of tosses, 100. And there it is. I get 36 and 64. And gives me about, I'll run it again. Oh, let me close this for a second. Let me get rid of this. This just gives us, now we know it all works, right? I'm just going to get rid of the C out. Run it again. Number of tosses, 100. Okay, 42 and 58. So about 60% of the time, right? And anytime you can always change it. You could change this number if you wanted. You would just change this number right here if you wanted to change that percentage. If it was like 40.5 or something, you could do 1 to 1,000. Or, like I said, you can use the random float function. This works perfectly fine to meet the requirements of this particular program now. Okay, and that is basically that program. So the new things are this random number generator, which we're going to use later in other programs.